Hi, everyone. Okay. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we start, I would like to introduce you to Professor Jennifer Santiago Oreta and Professor Jose Joel Canutari. um, Professor Jennifer Santiago Oreta is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and director of the Ricardo León Institute for Global and Area Studies of the Ateneo de Manila University in Philippines. Dr. Oreta was a U.S. ASEAN scholar under the Fulbright program in 2021 and was hosted by the TRACC Center, Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption of George Mason University. Under President Benigno Aquino's third administration from 2010-2016, she was Assistant Secretary for Policy of the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the peace process. She was part of the peace talks with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, representing the Philippines government in the Technical Working Group on Normalization, Disarmament, Demobilization of Arms and Forces from 2012 and 2014. In 2014 and 15, she led the crafting of the national government strategy, whole of government approach in dealing with conflict-affected areas. Currently, Dr. Oreta is a member of Human Security Advocates, a civil society organization focused on security sector reform and governance, peace building, and community security management. She is the focal person in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia of the DCAF, Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. She was part of the SSRG trainers team for Myanmar's Tatmadaw from 2017 and to 2019, and for Myanmar's political parties and civil society organizations from 2014. Dr. Oreta has done various policy research for the Philippine government and is currently involved in consultancy work on issues related to the peace process, security, and anti-terrorism. And now Professor Canudari is an anthropologist with an eye toward the study of visual systems, practices, and engagements of communities dealing with conditions of uncertainty. His research interests cover visual approaches to the grounded forms and practices of cosmopolitanism, armed conflicts, displacements, primary care, and anti-religious relations. He trained at the University of Oxford Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology, where he earned a D.Phil. Doctor of Philosophy in Social and Cultural Anthropology. Currently, Joel chairs the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of Ateneo de Manila University. He continues to engage journalists and journalism through my affiliation with the Mindanao Institute of Journalism, the publisher of the popular Mindanao's news website. We're going to start with Dr. Oreta's presentation.
Right. Hola. Buenas tardes. Me llama Jennifer Santiago Oreta. Hablo español, pero un poquito. I wanted to say that the blouse that I'm wearing today is deliberately picked. This is what we call batik. It's a common design in the down south, no, in the Southeast Asian area. So you will find this kind of design. Also, Dean Bopip also is wearing a batik, no. So you will find these kinds of design in the Mindanao area, but also in Malaysia and Indonesia. All right. So the presentation that I'm going to do today is focused on Colombia and the Philippines, but that this is actually a multi-country study. No? So this is led by the Giga Foundation in Germany, and it is supported by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And it covers different countries, no, in Colombia, in Venezuela, Cameroon, the Philippines, Tunisia, and South Sudan. But I'm not going to discuss all of them. I just decided to highlight the discussion this afternoon on the Philippines and Colombia. Okay, there. Now, the goal of the study actually is pretty straightforward. No? Number one, we wanted to look at the perception of peace, no, of people in different conflict and security contexts. No? And the purpose really is to have to generate policy recommendations or peace-building interventions, particularly designed for these kinds of for the countries that are involved. No? So this is the framework of the Giga Foundation for the multi-country study. So basically what we wanted to look at would be the various contentious issues or the incompatibilities, particularly the issue about the participation in government or lack of spaces for participation, the issue about territory, no, or the inability of the government to authoritatively distribute and allocate the territory as well as the resources, no. And then we wanted to look also in terms of the scope, no, how big, how small are the conflicts that are happening in the different areas, what is the root causes or what is the historical context of these conflicts, what is the level of violence, no. And likewise, in looking at the non-state armed groups, we also would like to see the mobilization patterns of these organizations. No? So this is the methodological framing of the multi-country study. So basically, after looking at the conflict formation, we will look into the pillars of peace. So you have here, you see there the colorful design or the circle with the three triangles. No, the physical integrity, the human rights, particularly individual and collective rights, as well as the mechanisms and institutions of transformation of conflict. But what we did actually, and I'm going to focus later on a more simplified design of this methodological frame. But before that, I'd like to emphasize that the Philippine leg actually is done by the Ateneo de Manila University, particularly the office that I'm representing under the School of Social Sciences. No? What we did is to do a triangulation of data. No? We started with the archival data and then we commissioned a survey, a national survey done by an organization called Pulse Asia. It's a popular organization in the Philippines that really conducts opinion survey. And then we did a series of qualitative data, no? as a way of triangulating the information or the data that we were able to gather. No? So in the qualitative data, we initiated several focus group discussions and key informant interviews in the following areas. And the areas that we have selected actually are deliberately chosen. No? The National Capital Region or particular areas in the National Capital Region was chosen because of the high level of criminality. No? The Zambales area is in the Luzon area of the Philippines. Later, I will show you the map. But it was chosen because it's exposed to the South China Sea. And hence, it has the conflict or the dispute with China with regard the territory directly affects the fisher folks in this area. Surigao del Sur and Dinagat, no, the third bullet, are chosen because of the presence of the New People's Army. No? Sorry, there. Sorry. So the Surigao del Sur and the Dinagat were chosen because of the presence of the communist insurgent, no? And it's the longest communist group, no? I think in Asia, the longest running communist, armed communist group in Asia. So they were chosen because of the presence of the New People's Army. Central Mindanao, because of the presence of the Moro National Liberation Front, or the MNLF, and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. No, these are two organizations that eventually separated, and they are both involved in the peace process. And finally, the last bullet, you have the Sulu-Basilan area. These are the island provinces down south, and they were chosen because of the presence of terrorist groups. So in other words, we chose these different areas for our focus group discussions and key informant interviews because the conflict dynamics are varied. No? And we wanted to see if the perception of peace of people and their appreciation of conflict and security actually is affected by the contextual reality that they are in. No? So as I've said, it is the Philippine leg was led by the Ateneo de Manila University. And this is how we simplified the methodological and the conceptual framework, and we used the systems approach. No? So you will see here, we looked into the contextual or the situation, the situation of the different areas, and then we look at the different institutions, no? The formal institutions of governance, the institutions of human rights, what are the institutions that are managing security and violence, institutions that manage conflict transformation, as well as the non-formal institutions, no, that usually are managed by non-state, no, organizations. And from here, we look at the manifestations of how people perceive peace and security. No? And the archival analysis basically was more focused on assessing the contextual reality of the different areas. The national survey, or the quantitative data that we gathered through the opinion survey, was really more focused on the availability of institutions and the perception of people with regard to these institutions. And then the focus group discussions and the key informant interviews really were meant to generate the opinion of people in the areas that we have, as I have said, we have selected, that I have discussed earlier. No? So the starting point of the research basically is the reality that peace actually is an aspirational concept. No? It means so many things to different people. No? So the beginning position or the beginning premise of the research is that given that peace and security are socially constructed concepts, it's actually defined by the contextual reality of the people. No? So there's no singular definition or singular appreciation of these terminologies. No? So they are framed by, as I've said, no, framed by the contextual realities of people, and in a transitional society or transitional context, no, the direct experience of the people actually influence the way that they appreciate this concept. No? And when we say transitional society, as you see in the slide, it's operationally defined in the research as a society that is in a transition, no? moving from one phase to the next. No? So it can be a political transition, like from an authoritarian state to a democratic state, or it can be a transition from being underdeveloped into a developing society. So this is what we mean, or this is how we define transition in the study. No? So the structural cleavages, no, that are brought about by the intersection of norms, no, of ideologies, no, or the geopolitical consideration, even historical processes that directly affect the political systems, are actually affecting the way that people understand and articulate their appreciation of peace and security. Now, the second premise that we use as a starting point is that conflicts are actually given, no, and they are manifested differently, no, and conflicts are present in various contexts because of the interest or the conflicting or contested interest between individuals, between groups. These conflicts can be suppressed, they can be managed constructively and peacefully or not. No? And the conflict dynamics actually is dependent on various factors. No? The capability of the organizations to mobilize, no? Resources, influence networks, no? Their access to resources, no? The capacity of the institutions in the area of where the conflict is happening to manage the contending issues of these organizations. So the conflict dynamics really are dependent, no, and influenced by these various factors. No? So given that, no, the study and the presentation that I've prepared is just focused on the two countries, no, Colombia and the Philippines, no. And I think in our conversation yesterday and today, I think there was already a discussion about the Colombian peace process a few days back, no, here in UPs, no, and probably you know more about the peace process in Colombia than us, no. But it's actually interesting to compare Colombia in the Philippines because when I was looking at the findings of our counterparts in Colombia, it's like reading our own our own country, no. So there are so many similarities, no, in terms of the development of the peace process in Colombia and the contextual reality of peace and security. Now, on the left side of the screen is the Philippines. No, it's an archipelagic country, and this slide or this picture actually I borrowed this from the Armed Forces of the Philippines. No, it's quite dated. It's 2011, but I think it is still valid or it's still relevant because here you will see the level of conflict that's happening. No? So when we talk about peace and conflict or the non-state armed groups' presence, it's not the entire country that's affected, only a certain part of the country. And then the intensity of the red actually is where there's more engagement, no, between the or more armed hostilities between the government, no, and the non-state armed groups. No? So you'll see that it's really concentrated down south. No? A lot of the conflicts are actually concentrated down south. In the north, there's hardly engaged, no, hardly any engagement between non-state armed groups and the state. No? So let's first look at Colombia. No? So basically, the findings of the team from Colombia argues that number one, war and violence, similar to the Philippines. No? War and violence is not widespread, but they are experienced mainly by the peripheral and the border areas. No? And the sources or the reasons for conflict are actually interrelated. No? They emerge and increase in the context of extractive policies, no? In the globalized economy. So they are directly affected by these issues. No? Let me just conflicts for territorial control also persist, no? Between non-state armed groups, between and among the non-state armed groups. There's a multitude of conflicts that generate, no, also a variety of experiences and notions of peace in Colombia. No? So although violence in the country has decreased in the last decade, the findings of the group is that there is significant variations in the regions. No? So some regions experience relative peace, others continue to experience conflict. No? Now, I wanted to highlight also the second point here. Threats and killings increased amid the pandemic condition, and recently violent practices of war, such as massacres and youth recruitment, have actually returned, according to the study by INDEPAS. No? Human rights laws are available. International statutes Colombia actually signed various international statutes of human rights. They have domesticated it. There is a translation in the domestic law, but there's still a significant gap between the human rights the implementation of human rights, particularly in urban and rural areas. No? And again, there's a lot of similarity here in the Philippines. No? The Colombia is one, according to the study of our counterpart in Colombia, it's one of the most dangerous countries for trade unionists, social leaders, and human rights defenders. No? But again, if we remove the word Colombia and replace it with the Philippines, it's still valid. No? In other words, the same is also very true, no, in our country. No, a lot of our human rights defenders are also being victimized, no, either being labeled as a communist, or some of them are actually targeted by vigilante killings. No. So violence goes unpunished. So there's a culture of impunity also in Colombia, and human rights defenders are left unprotected. No? And formal and informal institutions for conflict resolution exist. No? However, the state has very limited institutional presence in the territory, or actually the state is part of of having a contentious relation at the local level. No? So in terms of the perception of peace, there is no shared vision. No? In Colombia, there's no shared vision of peace. However, majority of those who surveyed agree that there are three fundamental elements, no, of peace. No? There has to be respect, there has to be justice, and there has to be tranquility. And the bullet points that you see there actually is an attempt to elaborate what they mean by tranquility, what they mean by justice, what they mean by respect. No? It's also interesting that the conception of these three values, no, that are associated with peace is not correlated with the experience of people in conflict. No? The people who, as I have mentioned earlier, in the context of the Philippines, we selected areas based on the conflict lines. In Colombia, they did the same. No? But it's interesting that the findings of the Colombian counterpart, which is also similar to our findings, is that there's no correlation on how they look at peace and how they experience violence and conflict. No? So the notion of peace in communities are closely related also to the expectations of people with regard to the peace agreement. No? So the 2016 peace agreement attempted to generate a national conceptualization of peace. No? So a peace being defined as a process of deepening democracy. No? The respondents also believed that signing the peace agreement is not the magic pill, but it's actually just, you know, a critical element in pursuing, no, the peace. No? So they also recognize that the people actually must take part in the construction of peace. And the end of war actually brought to light a lot of the conflicts, no, from different groups, no, the marginalized groups like the women, indigenous communities, the peasant, no, even groups, the LGBT population and the ex-combatants of FARC. Now, moving on to the Philippines, no, the appreciation of people also on peace is very contextual and personal. No? So the concept of justice, human rights remain as is a cerebral concept. No? It's a cognitive concept, and it's not part of the value system to live by. No? So they talk about it as an aspiration. They talk about it as something that they want, but it is not something that they hold on to as a value system. No? So they understand justice and human rights. They also have a high level of confidence on the capability of institutions. This was actually surprising for us when we saw this. No? The people have a high level of confidence on the capability of our state institutions to uphold justice and human rights. This is based on the national survey. But when we did the focus group discussion and the key informant interviews, that's when we saw the nuancing. No? For those who do not experience directly the problems of human rights and justice, they have high confidence, no, on institutions. But for those whose livelihood or whose welfare or whose safety, no, actually is threatened, they are the ones that challenge the capability of state institutions to promote and protect human rights, no, and enforce justice. No? Now, there's higher confidence. No, again, this is from the national survey. No, the people have a high confidence level on the local government units, and this is something that was a surprise to us. Their confidence on LGUs or local government units is actually higher than the church and the civil society. Now, the coming from an experience of people power in 1986, no, when we pushed out the dictator, led by civil society organizations and the church, no. So we have we thought that we have the one of the strongest, no, social movement or civil society movement in Asia, no, and yet it seems that the confidence level of people towards civil society and the church is actually going down, no, as illustrated in the national survey that we did. No, the level of political analysis also of the majority remains elementary. No, so this means that when we discuss about issues about institutional reform, political reform, it doesn't ring a bell. No, it doesn't resonate to the people. So, and hence they do not. Until now, the issue of political reform is something that is not appreciated by the majority. Now, what are the direct implications, no, in policy and programming? No, there has to be a process where the voice of the people actually are factored in the policy making. No, so we need to create a mechanism where the views and opinions of people, particularly in those in the community, must be heard. No, so we need to have a more deliberate effort to go where the people are. No, so for example, in crafting the national security policy and strategy, no, I sit as a part of the consultants of the Philippine government in crafting the national security policy and strategy, but it's really a very high-level discussion. No? The views of the people on the ground, no? Who's being protected by the state, no, is actually not being heard. So there has to be a mechanism for that. No, the state also must articulate clearly the peace and security policy, no, of the government. No, so the peace process, the peace negotiation, the agenda, it has to be clearly articulated so that the local government units, the security forces, particularly the military and the police, civil society groups, communities affected by conflict, will also know what is the direction of the peace and security, and hence they can directly contribute, no, in the process. No? And there has to be a communication plan. No? I think a lot of governments are having problems with regard to communicating, no, to the larger public, no, what is the policy, what is the direction, what is the strategy. So there has to be a strategic communication plan. We also need to strengthen the involvement of people on peace and security matters. We have some mechanisms on community policing, but that's not being maximized. I think that is a necessary intervention. And finally, and this is a reflection, no, of my team, no, doing the study. We also said that we really need to review the overall liberal capitalist agenda. I know it's a tall order, no, but capitalism has been the root cause of all the conflict and all the problems on peace and security. No, colonialism, which is one of the root causes of our conflicts, no, was fueled by the desire to generate profit. The conflicts among families, no, in the communities are also fueled by greed and self-serving interests. Marginalization and deprivation of communities are also consequences of the insatiable desires of power. No? In other words, no matter what we do, achieving peace and security and the related values of it, no, justice and human rights, will always be temporary, and threats to peace will always be present as long as the dominant ideological order is one that is fueled by profit and interest. No? And then this is my last slide. I just wanted to highlight, no, that given the geopolitical challenges that we are facing now, the U.S., the Russia-Ukraine, and the Israel-Palestine, and then we have we call it the hovering issues, no, the China-Taiwan cross-straits issue, the North-South Korea, the China and the South China Sea claimants, no, all of these issues are actually amplifying the conflict in many, regions, no, and we are in one conversation that we had in the among experts on peace building, we also highlighted the issue that there's a lot of funding cuts. No, there's a lot of peace building interventions in a lot of African countries, in Latin American countries, in Southeast Asian countries. The development aid actually is shrinking because funds actually are being funneled in Russia, Ukraine, and now that we have the Israel and Palestine, no, there's most likely, the budget will even shrink even more, no. But I was telling some friends earlier, the other concern that I have actually is that China might do something in the context of Southeast Asia. If the big powers' attention are actually in Europe and in Middle East, China might actually do something, no, in our, in our neighborhood. So there's a lot of challenges when it comes to peace building. But I will stop here. I think I'm over time already, so I will pass the microphone now to Joel to discuss about the Bangsamoro.
If you can indulge me for a bit, just trying to project. I hope this works. Okay. Hola. I'm very poor with Spanish. I won't even attempt. Though we do have a lot of Spanish words, but it tends to be, well, localized that only us can understand. Okay. As shared about my background earlier, that I'm an anthropologist by training, so I'm going to approach my intervention from an anthropological position and based on my fieldwork in various areas for the past few years in an island called Mindanao in the southern part of the Philippines. I did talk about several points. I did raise several points yesterday when we had the forum. But probably I'm returning to some of those points. Well, actually to most of those points, but adding a few more details on what I was trying to drive out, and then from there, probably look at this, view this from another perspective, from perspective of reflection and also from perspective of possibilities that we can do. I titled the at least this talk as winning the peace. It's a little bit cheeky, I know, a little bit corny to a great extent, but there seems to be some truth in this claim, as I would discuss in the talk this afternoon. And I did highlight yesterday that I'm seeing these efforts are quite fragmented, but there has been other things that's going on in this fragmented endeavor, the endeavor on winning the peace, particularly and primarily through interreligious actions, using dialogue in a troubled region such as Mindanao. I'm not moving the slides yet because I just want to highlight the picture. The picture is of a Jesuit priest and one of the ulama in the southern city in Mindanao. It's called Zamboanga City. They hugged before a crowd of internally displaced person in a conflict that just took place 3 weeks and 4 weeks before they hug each other. Just before they hug each other, there had already been some calls, some talks over text messages that Muslims in the city should rise up because this is the kind of attack against the religion, and that all Muslims should take a stand, not to take the violence, such as violence that they had suffered from that 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago of armed encounters that had actually flattened a huge part of the port city of around 600,000 population. So it was a huge conflagration, 2013, around that time. So they are in an evacuation camp, in an IDP, internally displaced camp, and they met there and to show that it's possible within the tensions, the background of tensions that had been happening around, that it's possible for two religious leaders, at least two religious representatives, to be seen in public hugging amid all the text messages that there has to be a rise up of a population. So I'm highlighting this because this is where I see the fragmentation of those efforts for dialogue, and particularly among interfaith groups, and then expanding later on as a it's not planned, but it's a recurrent endeavor that had its own successes in the peace endeavors. I'll move on. So I'll be situating this discussion on war, and also to some extent the role of religion, and the role of other forces and engagement beyond religion in these troubled areas. I'll be looking at efforts at interreligious dialogues, and will also view that beyond the effort of interreligious dialogues, a few more dialogic engagement had sprung from this engagement. I was actually I had become quite interested with this. Again, I didn't plan it, but as I do my work as an anthropologist, tracking and studying relationships in the community, this has actually become stark, especially in the area that I've been working on, because it's almost it cannot be ignored that this engagement had been happening around conditions of tensions, around conditions of conflict, and it implicates mainly Muslim and Christian villages. In not only in the area where I snapped the photograph, but also in many other parts of the region. To some extent, I was looking for a parallel of this experience some time back, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and I got hooked on some of the documentation by some academics on the Palestinian-Israeli war, particularly on the Israeli the settler movements into the Gaza area and the other parts of the Palestine, and it struck me because it's not as much covered, not as much highlighted in media coverage, that there had been little dialogues, small dialogues within the Palestinian territories between Israeli civil society groups and a few other religious groups that had been ongoing. It's small, but it carried on. And of course, if we watch BBC and other news outlets, you won't really hear from them because the focus is mainly on the big players, the big leaders. So there's a similarity in this because it's also an engagement, to some extent, a movement that had been going on, but would be hardly covered by the media, would hardly get attention in national conversation. It's just going as part of an organic engagement of people. That's probably why it's fragmented. That's also probably why it carries on under the radar. But I would like to see this as quite effective. The picture that you're seeing is a picture of a Protestant church in the city that I was referring to. It was one of the buildings that was struck by the conflict I was mentioning. It both struck religious edifices of both Christians and Muslim, and that's how intense the situation that led into those text messages of an uprising that I thought quite interesting. And then I began to track that event in 2013 and the event after 2013 and also the events before 2013. And if I map out the conflict in the southern area in the Philippines, this is how it will look like. It's like almost every year there's an armed confrontation. Sometimes there's a lapse of 2-3 years, but then another confrontation would again happen from many other areas in different parts of the region, whether it's in the Muslim enclaves or beyond the Muslim enclaves. It looks like this, and this is just a tip of the iceberg of the many confrontations that I could track way back in the 1960s all the way to actually all the way to now. And there had been a significant reduction of this confrontation compared to 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But the effect of the conflict carries on. Up to today, as we speak, there are still internally displaced persons in various areas in the city that I'm mentioning, and also in other cities that have been affected by conflict. So it's a mess of a place. It's half a century of violence, as I have noted here. But then the flip side of this, as I was mentioning, those fragmented movements that I was talking about, for every conflagrations of violence, for every episode of violence, there were counter movements on it. It's not organized nationally in a sense. There are some levels of national organization, but only to some extent. But if we look at it, they're also all across where the conflicts are happening. The city where that I was mentioning as I started, there were many of these dialogues, and in fact, this carried on from the 1960s to especially the 1970s, and all the way to now. It always has its flip side. It's not as much documented and covered and paid attention to, study-wise and theoretically, but it's creeping, it's emerging for every episodes of violence, which for me is quite fascinating that it has to be thought about and to be understood. And probably some lessons can be learned from this engagement. Yes, it's small scale, it's wide across, but then it can probably provide us a route, a roadmap on how to go about, how to address complex cases of violence. To some degree, as I was saying, the Palestinian territory conflict and Mindanao, there are a few, to some extent, parallelism, because the conflict is based on mainly on settling and on lands. I'll talk a little bit more about that. I just look at the patterns of displacement up to, well, I did look at this up to 2022, but I couldn't find my slides up to 2022, because every time I do some talks, I have to update it because every year something happens. So. And Apple touched on this, Dr. Oretta touched on this, saying that most of the conflict in the study that they look at took place in the southern regions. And this is how it looks like in terms of internal displacement patterns. Well, while the disaster-induced displacement, storms, earthquakes, is huge, it would affect millions of people, but these are quick displacement. But the displacement that you're seeing here on the screen is a multi-year displacement. Again and again, they get displaced if they're lucky. But if they're unfortunate, they would stay displaced for several years. And I was mentioning in some cities, the displacement had been going on for about 5-6 years now. They're not able to return, and in fact, there are no chances of return because there are other plans for the places where they need to return to. So that's the situation, and these are the people that are caught in this conflict. They're indigenous communities. They're referred to as Lumad in the area. They comprise around 2% of the population, 33 ethno-linguistic groups. But then when I say 2%, that's about over 2 million, 3 million people. It still is a large group and community. 20.4% Muslim, Bangsamoro, about 5 million or a little bit more. And then Christian Filipinos, those who profess Christianity is the majority. But as I was saying, there's a parallelism to some degree between the Palestinian and Israeli relations in this, in as far as the settlement or the land settlement factor of the conflict is concerned. So much of the 71% had come from elsewhere, primarily north of the Philippines historically, and have moved down south, and that had created some tensions across the year. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but just to highlight that this movement has deep roots, going back to colonialism And it carried on in post-colonial state building from 1945. That's supposedly the Philippine independence, the year of independence. But then in that post-colonial building, the colonial policy of resettling communities and population down south to where indigenous peoples are, to where the Bangsamoro, the Moro population, Muslim population are, had carried on. And in fact, were doubled down, were tripled down, were made fourfolds as a policy coming from the colonial community. This photograph, I got this from the archive of the U.S. Library of Congress. It's actually available in the Commons. It shows you the intent, the deeper the deeper colonial dimension of the conflict. This is about the American operations in the area where there are conflicts now, as we're speaking. So that complexity, the historical complexity, and also the post-colonial complexity, and the question of religions come into play in this. Just another picture of American soldiers who had themselves photographed proudly of their kill, also down south in an area that's been a site of conflagration. It's called Sulu in Holo, a Muslim enclave, and it was attacked during that time, and a massacre had evolved. And a few other scholars had been reworking on this, coming from the U.S. and the U.K., calling it the Forgotten American War, in a sense. This is the talks that I was the violence I was talking about, to a great degree, could also be tracked back in this sordid, painful experience of the past. The policy, the colonial policy that I was talking about, was not just about attacking enclaves. It's about setting up land policy, particularly reforming land system as integral administrative policy of first the Spanish government, but it was expanded by the American government, and later on by the post-colonial government, that led into, as I was mentioning earlier, into a migration of largely peasant Christian families from up north. You can see in the dotted lines going south. That led into a very sharp population in only one generation. This took place between 1920s to around 1950s, up to the early 1960s, but largely 20s to the 1950s, and the population shift I was talking about looks like this. Sorry, before that. It looks like this. That's the population shift I was talking about. In 1903, the region is primarily Moro, Lumad, indigenous, and Muslims, and only 37% are Christianized. By 1918, there was a movement wherein there's nearly a parity. This is already the colonial era, between Moro, Lumad, or native in the place, and also the settlers coming from the north. By 1948, there was already nearly a marked shift. By 2000, it was flipped entirely. The Moro Lumad has been the minority, a tiny minority of the area, and the Christian settlers coming from the north has become the majority. This is where I'm coming from. I was saying that there seems to be a parallel between the Palestinian experience and the Israeli experience. And the flip side of that is part of that policy coming from the colonial American land laws is the way lands were distributed. In 1902, the first of these land laws practically offered as an incentive for Christian settlers to come over to Mindanao. The size of conflicts currently in the past 50 years, they're offered 16 hectares of land. Just go and take those lands and had it titled. It's theirs for the taking. No payment. Just carried on and place their fate out in the land. No land provision for the natives, the locals, the Muslim Bangsamoro and indigenous Lumad. For corporations, they're given about 1,024 hectares, whatever corporation they are. In 1919, those land laws were amended in a way that the Christian settler families would at least the land to be granted to them. If they would resettle down south, they'd be given about 24 hectares, and there are a few land that were given to Muslim Moro indigenous population of about 10 hectares, but mainly this is an accommodation for the leaders, the datus that Dr. Ureta was mentioning in some of our engagement before. It's the same offering for the corporations. My family, I came from Mindanao. I grew up and I was born in the region. I'm of mix. My granddad had moved sometime in the 1919 period, but then he also married locally, and but that marriage, because in effect he's a settler. My grandmother and her family was able to learn about the land grants. Had he not been married to my grandfather, who's a settler, they would not learn of a land grant. So it's a stroke of luck, but that's the policy. And it carried on, the amendments, 1936, and then so on in post-colonial government. And this land relations that I'm mentioning was a critical ingredient in dispossessions that later on led to animosities, that later on led to deep-seated resentments of the population, especially on the settlers. And this is where religion would come into the picture, because locals couldn't really define the problem as just a land grant problem. In fact, when I was growing up, it's not the kind of problem that we would talk about in the dinner table, and also in the universities, in schools. It's not a topic that could actually be not only talk about, but could actually be a process in the mind. It's not part of the imagination. It's almost like a non-issue discussion, but it's happening across. So the way that it's being viewed, the way it's being looked at, that the problem is about religion, about religiosity. It's because that this group of people are Christians and this group are people of Muslims, and that's why they're fighting for lands. The photograph that you're seeing is a 1933 colonial photograph of an area that has been part of repeatedly affected by conflict. This is a settlement. The houses were settled. The settlers settlement coming from the north. All the lands that you're seeing on the foreground, at least for the settlers, they thought that these are empty lands, that no one owned them, but they're all actually occupied by indigenous peoples and Moro groups. Just to locate what is it on field. To some degree, it still looks like this way, but there's a lot of blood that was spilled in this from this time, 1933, all the way to now. The concrete that you're seeing is actually as an old Spanish fortification that were then used by the Americans as one of their headquarters to launch this initiative of resettling people from the north and providing them protection as they resettle. So this concern, this problem, this issue on land had, as I was saying, had become a fertile ground for reinterpreting this beyond land issues into, as I was saying, because land could not be grappled as an issue during this time, 1950s, 1960s. Only later that we begin to define it and people realize it, that it's a land issue. So it's being seen as a religious issue more than a land issue. And that led into the rise of contending militias coming from the indigenous groups, the Muslim Bangsamoro, and also Christian militias, particularly in the late 60s and the 1970s. And then they would launch attacks in the name of the religion to some degree, because they cannot really define it as land. No one can accept that the issue is land, and religion is one of the easiest to actually mobilize. So two forces, two communities organizing militias and arming themselves. over land, using religion as the meaningful well, action, or the meaningful reason why they're doing the mobilization, knowing fully well that they're doing it because they need to defend the land, but they cannot defend a land. They can only defend a religion at that period, that era. That had led into, well, the complication of conflicts across time. So the population had increased, the development had come in, but that issue, that the issue on land had persisted, that led into political conflict across time, presented into religious lines. These are just among a few photographs taken. I was doing my study, taken in the city that I was talking about. But this is just a sampling of the kind of damage that we can see on the ground. And when I say damage, we're talking of a large scale of people affected. In 2000, up to 1 million people were actually displaced. Accordingly, the total number of people that died in this conflict in the past 50 years would reach only about, I think, 20,000 or a little bit more. Many of them would be the armed groups, and some of them civilians. But the civilians are actually suffering the brunt, even though not as many would have been killed. And the displacement carried on today. State military interventions had been carried out in the past 50 years. That can partly explain, or that largely explain, the map that I was telling you about earlier. But much of the military mobilization comprised of recruits who are overwhelmingly Christians, that reinforce this idea that it is a religious conflict. Now, amidst this, around 1970s, mid-1970s, some of the religious leaders had thought that this had to be decoupled from the religious narrative, and had started engaging each other. It started with ulama and a bishop in a city called Marawi, which figured in more violence even after they're done. But to some degree, there was a meeting of mind, a meeting of hearts, and I was saying yesterday, they called their engagement as the dialogue of life and faith. I'm going to talk about a little bit more about that. But nonetheless, it opened the possibility, at least the possibility in 1973, 74, that to reimagine the conflict that they're seeing, the conflagration that they're seeing, in a dialogue, that this is not about religion. This is about something else. This is about land. They did it very simply. They didn't even talk about the roots of the conflict. They just thought that they meet, and probably they can strike some friendship. And as they met, they talk about each other's religion, because at this time, going from colonialism and all the way to this period, there's not much interaction between Muslims and Christians trying to know each other. But this was one of the compelling times we're in. There was a desire to at least know, no conversion, just know what Muslims are doing, what Christians are doing, and vice versa. Both have been interested in that. So asking each other about, what do you do in a Ramadan? What do you do in a Christmas? Just little things, and then slowly inviting each other to lunch together, to dinner together, and so on. And this is already in the 90s. This is where the continuing attempt to carry on with the dialogue. It's a group of bishops and ulama and Christian bishops, Catholic bishops and Protestant bishops going into Marawi, the city that has always been plagued by armed conflict, just to see where the conflicts are, and just to know and to feel each other's pain in that conflict. But as you can see, actually, they were still guarded by armed men, just to protect them, because they would never know. And this dialogue had carried on in a very low level manner. One, it was done in an island, in this island called Basilan, also a place of so much misery, of kidnappings and uncompletion of burning of houses, of displacement, and so on. Whatever probably violent scenes in Hollywood can imagine, it happened here, and more than it can't be imagined by directors. But they were able to start a conversation in that little by little it breaks the narrative of religious conflict. And this carried on all the way to today from a dialogue that they had carried out within an Islamic city in the Philippines. That's Marawi, the one that you see in the picture. That had become the frontier of Muslim-Christian interreligious dialogue in the region, coming from the hills of so much violence. To some degree, this is an encounter that none of them expected or didn't really know what to expect. They didn't know if it worked or it will not work. They just threw their hat in because they know that their neighbors, it cannot carry on. And as I was saying, as this dialogue is going on, the conflict would still start, would still carry on. And they would just carry on with the dialogue. To the point that the dialogue has been part of almost nearly every conversation, conflict or no conflict, that it spread out beyond the religious community, all the way to villages, and all the way to sectors, women, youth, civil society, and across. The picture that you're seeing here, this is part of my fieldwork in 2004 in a village down south, a province called Maguindanao. They didn't really broke us, but they initiated their own independent dialogue at the village level, knowing that there are many pain and hurts because they witnessed each other's killing, and it was a difficult process. It in the 70s, 20 years ago, that carried on. They never talked until they had the heart of talking to each other around 2004, about 30 years after the fighting. But they stayed neighbors all along. They just couldn't meet, and they decided that they have enough of continuing violence, and that dialogue is a way for addressing violence, at least in their village. They know that they cannot resolve the bigger issues, the complexity of deep colonial roots of the conflict, but at least they know that they can now talk to a neighbor who may have a different faith or may have a different story. They decided to create a space for peace, a zone for peace and children, or spaces for peace and children. The declaration is that we know that there are many things that cannot be resolved. We get that. But if you can, we call on both the army, the government, and the rebels to do your battle elsewhere, conflict elsewhere, not in the zones that they had declared as a zone of peace. They were a little bit smart in this because they did just make a declaration. They lobbied the armed groups. They lobbied the presidential office. They lobbied whoever network that they can find until they were able to mobilize high levels of positions in government. Those were assigned in the peace process. The former boss of Apple, the secretary of the peace process, they were able to mobilize them. And the armed groups also sent their representative declaring that we will respect the zone of peace. And yes, it did work. This little effort, village effort on the ground, it did work. And up to today, there had been no cases of tanks rolling. There had been tanks rolling in some other places, but not in their areas. The tension is still there. The wound is still raw, but at least it's not back to the conflagration that they had been seeing in 30 years. It carried on. They also had this very peculiar engagement that's based on cultural roots. We know what Ramadan is, but then they added a local word called duyog. It's a journey in Ramadan. It's just a simple engagement wherein it looks simple now, but it was difficult before. That each one would invite. Well, if it's Ramadan, they would encourage not only the religious but also students or friends to at least invite a guest who's not a Muslim into their home when they break the fast in the evening, because there would be plenty of food at that time. And in some universities had also sponsored breaking the fast, the iftar, in the halls of the university. At the Jesuit-run University Ateneo de Zamboanga, I get to be invited in there, and then the Muslim religious would also come. And sometimes they would do this in a town square, and then all the way to the houses. Very cultural and as well as religious. And the same thing, if it's Christmas, the Christians would invite the Muslims. Just this thing, just this simple engagement. They had something to talk about. I'm nearly done. In the city that I was mentioning when we started, there was a siege 2013, but then as I was saying, they thought that they had to be seen. So they were already seen hugging each other amidst the call for violence, and they thought that they had to carry on with that engagement, with the dialogue. It's not so much an agenda that they would. I witnessed this dialogue that they did. They're like kids. Like, what do you do how do you eat food? Why don't you eat pork? Why don't things like that? It's almost like an innocent question coming from each other, and then until they thought that, okay. Maybe it's time for us to be seen a little bit more better, and in that armed encounter in that city that I was mentioning, there were burning of chapels, of churches, and also targeting of mosque. So they decided that they come together to repair the mosque, paint it together, plug in the bullet holes in the concrete. The same thing, the Muslim leaders, the ulama also came to the chapels, rebuilt the chapels for everyone to see. In a sense, I was thinking if there's enough peace processes that can address that. But this simple initiative at the local level had done a long way in to some degree, quickly stopping and moving down, tamping down the tension. And it's almost like magic. It's almost like it just happened because it's so organic that there's a level of trust. Of course, it's not a total trust. There's still criminality and some level of distrust. But then the possibility of just one group going out in the streets, killing whatever they can see on site, Hutu Tutsi kind of scene, that never happened. Primarily because of this low-level violence. You can they also invited the military, they invited the rebels to be among those who would paint the concrete that had been damaged in it, and they seem to be having a good time and making friends in it. So these are all ongoing, and there had been attempts to scale up the dialogues, and it was scaled up, but then it always go down to these grassroots efforts, not only to sustain it, but to keep it happening on the ground. So that had been one of the turning points in this, the scaling up and also the scaling down of the dialogues and spreading it in different parts. To the point that in 2017, the huge armed conflagrations that had happened, and this actually struck me because I expected that the media reportage would focus on the violence, and particularly in the area that was attacked in the inset map. It's called Marawi. The group that attacked it are armed groups that had pledged loyalty to the Daesh, ISIS, and they vowed to kill all Christians that they can find. And it was the entire city was actually destroyed, leveled to the ground, the main district area. But then the media narrative at the time, which actually struck me, but probably it also came from the community, is that they were talking about a Muslim family who actually had come to keep some Christians at home, and there were reports. They also reported the media that what the armed groups had done is to stop anyone in the street that they could see, or if there are houses that they know would still be occupied by people, they come in and ask people to recite the Al-Fatiha, the opening verses of the Quran, the prayer. And if they cannot memorize it, they would shoot them. So learning about this, they hide many of the Christian friends that they had. And these are the narratives that they've been telling the media. It helped tamp down the rhetoric that had been going on in the past 30 years, that this is a huge religious war. So it went beyond the confines of the bishops, of men. In fact, it went into a more, shall we say, pluralistic engagement to some degree. As I was saying, the interreligious dialogue may have played a critical role on this, on these processes, but over time, it no longer became just an interreligious dialogue. It became an organic engagement of peoples in communities. Because to begin with, they are communities of faith, and it's every village would have faith groupings. They would have chapels. It's ubiquitous. It cannot be ignored and defined away. And they also use that as a way to engage, to touch base, to address the violence in their midst. I was just thinking about this, that this is probably the nature of dialogue, and that for every conflict that we would see probably in many other parts of the world, it might be good not to lose sight of the many organic engagements of reaching out that we are seeing, because there's a lot there of humanity that we can find out, we can learn from, and just probably this may not be a scaled up dramatic kind of engagement, and may probably be unfinished everlastingly, but it's something to think about. We're thinking of Israeli-Palestinian conflagration now, but it's also possible to go back to the earlier documentation that there are many dialogue groups in this area, and to go back there, just probably that could be a path in bringing back normalcy, at least to some degree, and we stop seeing the killings. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
No questions? Sí. Bueno, si quiere más bien.
Does this work? Okay, perfect. I don't really have a question. I just had a comment, and I wanted to thank both of you because, as some of you may know, I'm from the Department of Environment and Development, and we don't often talk about the intersectionality of conflict and religion. We often talk about the intersectionality of environment and other fields, and I would say, we don't do as good of a job as we should, but we try and talk about the historic impacts of colonialism and contemporary neocolonialism and imperialism on the environment. So I just wanted to thank both of you, because I think you drew out some of those complexities. And in the situation that we are facing globally and historically, I think I just wanted to thank you also for this last talk, to illustrate that sometimes, and we talked about this yesterday in the dialogues, sometimes we can posit something as a one-factor conflict, like you were saying, as a religious conflict. And in the same with the first talk, you showed us that capitalism is at the root of so many things. We could also say that racism, white supremacy, land grabbing, disrespect for lives, human rights, access to land. And you showed in the second talk an excellent dichotomy between who got access historically to which land and who was excluded. So I just wanted to, I'm here to learn. Like, I don't really even study the areas that you study, but it resonates with me, what I'm feeling today, currently, and a lot of the topics we teach about in the environment, and just want to highlight that I greatly and deeply appreciate you bringing out those nuances, and it encourages all of us when we see something as a one-factor issue, or if you, as you said in the media, we often depending on the media that we read, we might be reading something that is much more complex than we're seeing. So I just wanted to thank you for bringing those nuances, showing that in the context of the Philippines, which is very new to me, and it's given me a lot to reflect on in my classes and for the students. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.
It's working. It's working.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it is.
Really? Okay. So thank you very much, both of you, for the excellent presentations. And you mentioned that you're part of the, or somehow associated with the group that's doing the, or in charge of the national security policy, right? And you talked about, like yesterday, you also carried forward the importance of dialogue. So my question to both of you is, how much, as part of the national security strategy, is there a focus on the next generation or the youth in particular, particularly in the importance of conflict resolution, nonviolent communication, dialogue at the educational level, at the the lowest levels of education, but also at the university level, because a lot of this violence can emanate from university settings around the world, but also the culture of peace can be imbibed at the educational levels as well. So how much has that been mainstreamed into the national strategy in Philippines, and is there room for further embedding it?
The experience of the Philippines in crafting a national security policy is new. So we've been independent for many decades, but the first time that we formulated our national security policy was in 2010. So this is the third iteration. No? So it follows the administration, the coming in of a new administration. So from 2010 to 2016, 2016 to 2022, and now we are formulating for this administration. Now, with regard the youth, no, are they factored in? The policy and strategy are couched in strategic context. No? So they are all motherhood statements. The strategies are more operational in nature, but it's the strategy, the policy and the strategy supposedly are the anchor of national action plans, no, of different agencies and different departments. No? So right now, while we are doing this policy and strategy, there is also a parallel effort that tries to craft a national action plan on youth for peace. So we have the Women, Peace and Security. There is now an intervention to talk about the youth, peace and security. No? And it's really a recognition that all of the things that we are doing and all of the things that we have failed to do are actually will be taken care of by the next generation. So there's in other words, there's a lot of consciousness that the youth must be brought in, but in terms of operationalizing it, no, that's another story. So cognitively speaking, policy level, we are trying to put them there, but in terms of actually implementing it, creating spaces, no, for the youth to participate, for the youth to intervene, that's actually the bigger challenge. No? In other words, it's perhaps the next challenge that we need to hurdle.
Very quickly, from the way I see it, if you're asking about the mainstreaming of this thinking of this engagement at the level of the curriculum, at the concrete level, it's not happening, at least at the national scale. But there are initiatives from various universities in various regions, especially in areas that are affected by conflict. Zamboanga that I was mentioning, the cities that I was talking about, they're doing it at the level of the university. But it's probably not really a conscious, strategic kind of decision. It's more of a reaction to every episodes of violence that they're seeing. That there's a realization that they had to put that out in the open in the classrooms. At least they're starting at the level of holding forum, holding seminars around it. but unfortunately, it has not really rise yet to as what Apple was saying, Dr. Oreta, at the level of operationalization. So it's a consciousness, it's there, but it's not translated into actual implementable policy. It's not in the basic education, it's not in higher education, and it's really more private initiatives at the moment.
There's actually an executive order, no, but the executive order is not fully implemented, no. So there's an executive order on peace education. However, I think the major limitation would be the availability of materials that can be used in the primary and the secondary level. So on the policy level, it's there, but but the availability of materials and the skill level of the ones delivering it is also a challenge, no? So that's where we are. That's why the problem is always the implementation. We're quick to the draw in terms of creating policies, but the mechanisms for implementation actually is a challenge.
I have a question. Thank you. It's working? Thank you, Dr. Apple and Dr. Jose. It has been wonderful for me, because I'm very familiar with the Colombian case, to draw those parallel lines with the Philippines. And of course, the case of the Sons of Peace is super insightful for, the peace building professionals to learn more about the details of how communities actually appropriate peace and reject war and reject violence. So my question is more on the publication side. If you have publications on the Sons of Peace that perhaps you can share, or if you think they're, in Colombia, they're very proactive on websites. So the Sons of Peace, the communities of peace there, they have their own websites, and, they post constantly. They're very politically active. And I'm wondering if that's the case in Mindanao as well. And also, if you could give us a little bit of more information, if they are considered in the implementation of the provisions of the Bangsamoro CBA as implementing partners of the provisions. Thank you.
I'll probably go for the first question, and the policy one would be Dr. Oreta. The publications, there are a few, in fact, but all over the place. A few websites here and there, a few academic articles. I've written 2 or 3 on this, and I thought that there's a lot more to write about. And there's a website that's dedicated to this kind of reportage. Well, I'm not plugging it because I'm part of it, but it has a historical engagement. It's called mindanews.com. There's a lot of resources that you can find in that website, because and someone else is making a whole library on the peace process, just so that this can be kept, and at least if the next conflict would happen, probably there are resources to return to, because everyone is hopeful for the peace to be sustained, but are also pragmatic enough to see that it can immediately go in another direction. So there are a few, and there's one organization that sadly is it has not shut already. It probably had already shut. It's called International Alert. I think it's if you're familiar with it. But they're shutting in the Philippines due to, I think, funding concerns, because the Philippines was thought to have won the peace to some degree, but there are still a number of conflicts, smaller ones, not as dramatic, but that's no longer getting any help and any attention. But there are a lot of lessons that has not been written, and that should be written. For the second question.
No, the zone of peace has been with us for several decades. I'm older than Joel, no, but the first encounter that I had with the zone of peace was up north. No, so it's not only in down south, but up north. I think 30 years ago, I was with we visited IP indigenous communities in the Cordillera that has declared themselves a zone of peace. No, they don't want the military or the New People's Army or the communist insurgent to enter their area. But I think the major challenge of sustaining the zone of peace would be the operationalization, because the idea is that the armed groups are not supposed to bring their firearms inside. So we were discussing, so what do we do with the military or the armed group when they enter these communities? Do we have a depository area outside? So these kinds of operational details actually were part of the challenge. No, second would be the suspicion of both sides. No, so when I was in Bukidnon, no, one of the Jesuit community there is declared as a zone of peace, but both the New People's Army and the military suspect the community. The military thinks that they are harboring insurgent groups inside. The insurgent groups are thinking that they are parroting the message of the military. No? So in some areas it works, but in some areas the community becomes more vulnerable from both sides. No, because there's really no guarantee that they can sustain that declaration of zones of peace. No, now in terms of policy, I think it's only the children as zones of peace that's been legislated. No, so we have a legislation declaring children as zones of peace, meaning no armed confrontation should happen anytime that there are children around. No, so in schools, no, so the military and the armed groups are not supposed to be present in schools. So this is the manifestation in policy. Some other experiences of some features of these zones of peace, for example, would be in Sulu, down south, no, in the island provinces. A former commander of the Moro National Liberation Front, no, he's exasperated with fighting. He said, "I don't want to fight anymore." So he initiated an effort within the community that all men should sign an agreement that they will not bring their firearm outside of their residence. So that's actually a very specific manifestations of, it's not a big zone of peace, but it's just that no bringing of firearms outside. No, and in that particular area, it is a very common occurrence that civilians would bring their firearms. The first time I visited that area, I was welcomed by a civilian with an M16. No, so and I was saying, isn't that actually attracting more attention? And he said that it's common here. No, we need to protect you because you're an outsider. No, so having a declaration that you're not bringing your firearms outside of your residence is actually a big thing. So I think that is the challenge of I'm actually a firm believer also of the zones of peace, but we need to have a better handle on how we can sustain it, no? Because the community cannot simply just declare that we are a zone of peace. But how are you going to sustain it? How are you going to ensure that both parties will honor the practice? So there has to be some operational details on how we are going to implement it.
A quick caveat on for the clarity on what I just noted about the zones of peace. In the committee that I was studying, they actually didn't use the zones of peace. They used spaces of peace because of the bad connotation. But then they use zones for the zones of children as zones of peace. So they called it spaces of peace and children as zones of peace. It's a mouthful of name. I was wondering, is that grammatically problematic? But then, yeah, that's the reason, because the armed groups would agree on children as zones of peace, but not the zones of peace. And I think in the area where I studied, it worked there because they did it in parallel with the peace process, and they were astute enough to engage the high levels of the rebel formation and also the government officials. but in other areas where, of course, even the peace process is contentious, like the communist movement, I think it has never worked there. And one of the reason why they don't use the zones of peace, because of that suspicion, especially coming from the communist side of the conflict. So it's a little bit complicated, though there had been continuing efforts around these areas. It's just that it's difficult to find a handle. So it became a case-to-case, area-to-area basis of success. But nonetheless, it's still good to see this, even though it's not scaled up nationally, compared to nothing. I think that's what I'm thinking about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just fascinated by the discussion here. And I'd like to follow up what you thought about how this can be scaled up to education. Because when Joel was talking about the dialogue, it sounded as if it was an easy thing to do, but it's not easy because not everyone is capable of initiating a dialogue. It takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of capacity building. And it occurred to me, if it's not happening in the schools, it's happening down there because they do it by example. So the people in the area would be able to have a look at what's happening there. So they don't need textbooks to be able for them to learn how to do a dialogue. But because that is not what Department of Education is all about, we'll have to begin it again at that level of where people are still young and are able to make this as part of their habit, to go into a dialogue instead of fight, to get an arm and fight immediately. I was just wondering, because, from your own experience, and you've witnessed it there, you've witnessed the effect of this in very little ways. I know it's not easy to introduce this into a system, but would workshops perhaps be generated? Would there be a group that would, a dialogue kind of group? We know we do a lot of teacher training, but this can also be part of training that will really be it will have a long-lasting effect. Because if it's happening down there, I keep on thinking, how do they build champions in the area? They're not, the people who are doing the dialogues there are not giving a lecture on a dialogue. They just do it. But how do you create the champions in the area? How does one realize that maybe I'm able to do it, even at a young age? So something of that sort might be interesting, because Apple was saying that there's a dearth of material. But if someone is bold enough to do a textbook where the main stream, even if it's an English textbook, the main theme is dialogue, build into the textbook the kind of dialogue. There's a lot of material, I suppose. So just a thought.
And I guess the dialogue is not just. I was reminded that in 2010, 2011, we initiated also a dialogue between civil society groups and military officials. Coming from a history of martial law, civil society and military are always antagonistic with each other. But in 2010, the military formulated a campaign plan that says multi-stakeholder engagement. So we hold them to account to it, and we said we're going to initiate a conversation between civil society and military officials. And we did it in the national level. We got the go signal of the higher ups of the military. We did it in the local level. And what we experienced is that the first time we provided the space. No? So you have the civil society here and the military here. And then they started, accusing each other. And we allowed them. And I was telling my friend, let them have their catharsis. So they accuse each other, and then when they got exasperated, they got tired of all the accusations, Then they started talking, so how do we now move forward? And we were able to do this in a lot of the conflict areas, no? So we were able to sustain with the funding support also of the Australian government, no? So we were able to conduct a quarterly dialogue between civil society organizations and military officials. Now, fast forward to the 2013 siege that Joel was talking about. During that time, the group that attacked Zamboanga called on an MNLF official somewhere in Lanao del Sur. No, he wanted the leader Nur Miswari. No, wanted the leader to mobilize forces to augment the forces that was attacking Zamboanga. No. But because of the series of dialogues that we've had, no, between civil society and the military, there's already a level of confidence between the CSOs and the military. So they were able to work together to convince this MNLF commander not to initiate a counter-attack, no, and help those who are attacking the siege. So in other words, planting the seeds actually work, no? But you'll have to really invest time, no? Because the conversations that we had was in 2010, the event happened in 2013, and we said for the first time we were able to harvest some of the, the seeds that we planted. So if we're going to initiate a book on the as a support for the education or the peace education, we can actually start with experiences, no, and lessons learned from dialogue.
Just quickly, and I guess UPs can this is what you've been doing. Just can imagine how you started this. But the way I'm seeing it in the context in the Philippines, that we're actually education on the education question, we're actually starting from, it's not really zero, but we're starting from very little engagement. And the way I'm seeing it, it's an opportunity that can be done. But then it would probably require some mobilization of both resources and people. Just a disclosure, I was just given the task to head a center for dialogue and collaboration. That these are among the things that's actually that's giving me sleepless night on how to think about this, because I know how hard it would be, because this is not, it's almost like, I was just right, it was almost like a walk in the park, because this is being told in hindsight, but on the ground you'd never know, the people would never know if there would be any success of the engagement that they're doing. They can only claim that success once they've done it, but as they're doing it, there's no formula. And probably those are part of the lessons that can be learned from, and probably you also realize that in your own work.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, for coming here, you for sharing your knowledge. And yeah, thank you.